Hello everyone, and welcome to the video for the first learning objective in topic 3.2. Click over to that. All right, so what are we going to be talking about here? We're going to be talking about assignment and delegation. So these are the rules that you use to transfer the obligation of or the right to receive a benefit from a contract. And I'm going to break that down for you a little bit here. So that's the main difference is to understand for this learning objective, what is the difference between, I guess I should move myself here, what is the difference between assignment and delegation in the first place, and then how do they operate differently? So that's what we'll spend our time talking about. Okay, now I have to move myself back. All right, so I came up with this little diagram to try to explain the difference between a right and an obligation, because you have to understand the difference between a right and an obligation before you can understand the difference between an assignment and a delegation. So when one of the parties agrees to do something, to provide make some sort of promise, they have an obligation, right? So, and they are referred to as the obligor. So the obligor has an obligation. So you'll see here an obligation is a duty owed by one party, which is the obligor, to a contract to the other party, which is the beneficiary. So you'll see here, this obligation goes to this side, and this party now has the right, which is the other side of this obligation. And in most contracts, there are obligations in both directions. So this party will have the rights associated with this obligation, but will also have obligations which will create a right for this party. So a right we have defined here as the benefit received by a party who's the beneficiary to a contract from the obligor. Okay, so let's think about how this would work in a real transaction. So let's think about a mortgage loan. So let's say over here we have the lender, and over here we have the borrower. So the lender is obligated to lend money to the borrower. So the borrower, under this contract, has a right to receive money from this lender. Okay, in exchange, the borrower has an obligation to repay the loan. So the lender has the right to receive monthly payments in exchange for the obligation to lend money. So that's the difference. So in this case, the right to receive the money is owned by the lender, and it's owed by the borrower, who's the obligor. Okay, so that's how we have to think about who, in any contract, what right does a given party have, and from whom do they receive that right? Which obligor? It's not always as easy as this. There's sometimes many parties involved in a contract, and they all have rights and obligations to each other. But you always have to think, which transaction are we talking about? What part of the transaction are we talking about? And are we talking about a right or an obligation? Okay, so let's look at assignment. So assignment deals with the transfer of a right, not of an obligation. It's the transfer of the right to a third party. Okay, so, oops, sorry, let me click back. Okay, all right, so it's the transfer of a right to a third party. So in the case of the mortgage loan, the lender, who has the right to receive the monthly payments, can transfer that right to someone else, can assign that right to somebody else. And that often happens in mortgage loans. Most of the time, the bank that makes the original loan doesn't keep it. They sell it to somebody else. And the borrower still has to make their payments. They just make them to different lenders, whoever it is that owns it at the time. And sometimes mortgage loans can transfer ownership hundreds of times over a 30-year period of time. Okay, if the original contract is in writing, then the assignment has to be in writing. So whatever the rule is for the original contract applies to the assignment. So if the mortgage loan was written, which it has to be because it's a real estate transaction, then the assignment would have to be in writing. If the contract doesn't say anything about whether a right is assignable, then it's most rights are assignable without the contract needing to say so, although the contract will usually spell that out. But the idea is that if you own a right, it's almost like a property right, you have the right to receive whatever the obligation is from the obligor. You can transfer that. You can sell it for value to somebody else. The exception to that is in personal services contracts. So a good example of this would be lawyers. So if you were to hire me as your lawyer, then you have the then I can't assign you. I can't assign that the contract to another lawyer, and because in that case the services are different. So and you can't assign it to another client. So your right to receive the legal services is not assignable, even though you have a right to receive them. Let's say you paid me money in advance. You can't say, well, I'm just going to assign this I'm going to sell my right to receive your legal services to someone else. You can't do that because of the nature of the lawyer-client relationship. And the last point here is that it's not always a one-to-one ratio. So in the case of a mortgage loan, you can sell different parts of the rights. So the mortgage bank, for example, might sell the right to receive the payments to another bank, and might assign the right to service the loan, to collect the payments on behalf of the owner, to a servicing company. So they can split the servicing rights with the repayment rights. And it even gets far more complicated than that. When you get into large financial transactions, you can strip out the interest from the principal payments, and then you can do all kinds of crazy things. So, and my daughter is about to walk, I think, behind me here. So, and then, so that's what we mean by multiple assignments to multiple parties. Okay? So remember, big thing to remember, you can assign a right, usually, without the consent of the other side. Most contracts will spell this out, but if they don't, the right is usually assignable, except in the case of personal services contracts. Okay, now let's look at the other side, the obligation. The obligation is the same rule that delegate. So when we transfer an obligation, it's called a delegation. So the obligation to make the obligation to make, that was my daughter's friend, the obligation to make the payment to the lender is, you can't delegate that to somebody else. So I can't say, I'm going to have my neighbor start paying my mortgage for me. I can't delegate my authority, my right, or my obligation to do that. He might make those payments for me if he wants to, but it's still my obligation. I can't transfer that obligation unless the other side agrees, or unless the contract provides for it. So the default rule for delegations is that if the contract is silent, it's usually not delegable. And then oftentimes when you delegate, you still retain some obligation. So for example, if I were to delegate my mortgage payment to my neighbor and he were to take it over, I would still be liable if he didn't make the payments like he was supposed to in many cases, unless I'm released by the other side. And we'll talk later about what a release is. So just remember, the big rule is that assignments are the transfer of a right, and that usually the holder of a right has the right to transfer it, whereas the delegation is the transfer of a duty or an obligation, and that generally the obligor cannot transfer that without consent. Okay, those are the basic rules, and so thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.